This is a video about the Peace of Westphalia. Don't feel bad if you don't know what it is. When I tell people that I am studying the Peace of Westphalia, sometimes they ask me, "Oh really? Which piece of Australia?" The brief summary is, the Peace of Westphalia consisted of two treaties signed in 1648, ending the 30 Years' War between the Holy Roman Empire, now Germany, on one hand, and France and Sweden on the other. Ending a war that went on for more than a generation might seem like a major accomplishment, comparable to the Congress of Vienna putting an end to the wars of the French Revolution. On the other hand, if the war had already lasted 30 years, maybe everybody was already so tired of fighting that peace could have broken out on its own. That's why some people refer to Westphalia as a peace of exhaustion. Besides, the Congress of Westphalia lasted 5 years, maybe more depending on how you count it. The parties agreed in 1641 to start negotiating, but peace was only signed in 1648. Whole wars, including World War I and World War II, have been fought in less time than it took them to make peace. How much skill did that take? And the Peace of Westphalia did not usher in a long period of peaceful relations among European states, the way the Congress of Vienna did. It didn't even give 2 decades of peace, like the much maligned Peace of Versailles in 1919. In fact, the Peace of Westphalia didn't even end all the wars that were going on at the time. The biggest of them, between the superpowers France and Spain, continued until 1659, more than 10 years later. During this time, just the first decade after 1648, a new major war broke out in the Baltic that drew in Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Brandenburg, and Russia. When that conflict, known in Poland as the Deluge because of its great destructiveness, ended in 1667, the last remnant of the 30 Years' War was still not over. Spain finally gave up its attempt to reconquer Portugal in 1668. That was less than 5 years before the next great European war broke out, one involving all the participants of the Peace of Westphalia. As a comprehensive and enduring peace, therefore, Westphalia is a notable failure. And yet this long, inconclusive treaty, signed over 350 years ago, is actually a hot topic among political scientists today. Books keep popping up with titles like The End of Westphalia or Beyond Westphalia, again and again and again. The Peace of Westphalia has been important since the day it was signed, but the reasons people view it as important have changed several times. There have been roughly 4 stages in the interpretation of Westphalia, overlapping of course, but more or less chronological. At the time the peace was made in 1648, it was celebrated chiefly by Protestants, who saw it as a sort of Magna Carta of their religious liberties. What does an international treaty have to do with religious freedom? At issue was the religious division in the Holy Roman Empire, which was a federated structure something like the United States, with the central government and many regional governments, duchies, counties, marches, and so forth. The empire was supposed to be Catholic, that's why it was holy, but the Reformation had begun and taken root there. Catholics, Lutherans, and Calvinists coexisted uneasily, afraid that their opponents would become too powerful and take over the whole government. At the beginning of the 30 Years' War, Catholics were in the ascendant and many Protestant areas were re-Catholicized. Protestants were only able to reverse this trend with the active intervention of France and Sweden. The treaties of 1648 entrenched the legal status quo and set up France and Sweden as guarantors. Protestants felt that they had been saved from imminent destruction, hence their celebrations. This view of the Peace of Westphalia was popular for about a century. When the German poet Friedrich Schiller wrote a history of the 30 Years' War, this was how he interpreted it, as a Protestant victory, and most of the towns that commemorated the event were Protestant. Today, Augsburg still celebrates its High Peace Festival on August 8th, and Westphalia is remembered in Germany as a triumph of toleration. But religion has long since ceased to be a pressing issue in Western Europe. Already by the end of the 18th century, the idea of tolerance had taken such a root that the Peace of Westphalia was no longer important in protecting Protestantism. Instead, it was the political importance of a federated German state that struck observers. By limiting the power of the central government in matters of religion, The Peace of Westphalia had also made it difficult for the empire to act as a unified military power. The regions of the empire could and did get together to defend themselves against invasions, but it was virtually impossible for them to agree to any interventionist foreign policy. For neighboring states, especially France, a weak Germany was a major feature of their security. Voltaire and Rousseau praised the Peace of Westphalia for establishing this principle of a weak Germany. Even after the Holy Roman Empire was officially disbanded in the early 19th century, it was replaced by the German Confederation, which kept to the same decentralized principle. In 1866, a French statesman named Adolphe Thiers praised the Peace of Westphalia for contributing to the peace and stability of Europe, and argued that it embodied the highest principle of European politics. That was easy for him to say. A united France could be a major player on the international stage, while the small states of the German Confederation were weak and mostly concerned with local affairs. As people in the 19th century became more nationalistic, Germans were struck by the incongruity of their power relative to their population and wealth. Not only did France get the better deal out of the Peace of Westphalia by remaining strong relative to Germany, but it had actually gained German-speaking territory in 1648 in Alsace and Lorraine. When Thiers praised the Peace of Westphalia in 1866, he didn't know that the principle of a weak Germany was about to be overturned. In 1871, Germany united into a modern nation-state after winning a war against France, and at the same time retook the provinces of Alsace and Lorraine that had been the visible evidence of Germany's long prostration. Until 1945, French and German scholars debated the Peace of Westphalia chiefly in terms of these provinces, and whether France had gotten them fairly in 1648. France retook Alsace and Lorraine after World War I, but Germany re-annexed them in 1940 after their successful conquest of France. The Nazis erected an exhibit in Münster, where the Treaty of Westphalia was signed, in which they called the Peace of Westphalia, quote, France's greatest triumph, Germany's deepest shame. Today, the world is largely secularized, Germany is united, and no one cares about Alsace and Lorraine. Nevertheless, the book titles shown previously demonstrate that we are still considered to be in a Westphalian state system. What does this mean? Put briefly, Westphalia has become synonymous with sovereignty, the idea that governments are and should be independent, and that intervention in each other's affairs is both morally wrong and potentially destabilizing. This was certainly the general basis for international relations. The United States, for example, does not allow California or Texas or any other state to make its own foreign policy, and certainly would not recognize any treaties that states would make with foreign countries. By the end of the 20th century, however, the principle of non-intervention was widely challenged, in theory and in practice. The United Nations has intervened in any number of states for humanitarian reasons, to care for refugees, to prevent killing, or to feed people in a famine. Sometimes, as in Yugoslavia, the sovereignty of the central government was already breaking down. There is a general reluctance to violate sovereignty in other cases. After all, even the UN Charter declares that it is based on the sovereign equality of its members. But the idea that the people living in a country have their own rights has also taken hold. Therefore, when Saddam Hussein attacked the Kurds in the 1990s, the United States did not intervene directly, but did enforce a no-fly zone for Iraqi jets over Kurdish territory, a clear violation of Iraqi sovereignty, even if less egregious than placing American soldiers in Kurdistan would have been. Somehow, Westphalia has come to stand for absolute acceptance of sovereignty and non-intervention. Hence the claims that we are now moving beyond Westphalia, toward a period of accepting intervention as a legitimate principle of international relations. But this is exceeding odd, considering that, as we have seen, the Peace of Westphalia was itself based in large part on French and Swedish intervention in the Holy Roman Empire on behalf of Protestants. How did a treaty based on intervention become a symbol of non-intervention? How have we come to associate Westphalia and sovereignty?